Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wednesday Word. My name is Amy Gingrich, and I'm publisher and executive director at Menno Media, where we publish each quarter our adult Bible study curriculum. The adult Bible study provides a look at the Bible from an Anabaptist perspective, and this Bible study we know is used by many congregations and Sunday school classes across Canada and the United States. Since churches started meeting digitally in March with the onset of COVID-19, we've been thinking about how to deliver additional helps to congregations. Today's webinar grows out of that thinking, and I am delighted to welcome all who have come today. The Adult Bible Study this summer quarter focuses on the many faces of wisdom. God is experienced as wisdom in both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament. During this quarter-long study, we are exploring the many facets of wisdom as recorded in the book of Proverbs, the Gospels, and the letter of James. Here in June, we've been specifically looking at the nature of God's wisdom as understood in the book of Proverbs. Our webinar today is being recorded and it will be available later online. During our webinar, I invite you to send in comments and questions through the Q&A function, and we will be happy to take your comments toward the end. Before we welcome our conversationalists today, I do want to note that we at Menno Media have been delighted to offer this webinar series during the month of June. Personally, I have found it invigorating to discuss the Bible and hear insights each week from our panelists, but attendance has been low, I'm sure for a variety of reasons. And so today will be our last weekly installment of this Wednesday Word series for the summer. Our team is reconfiguring and retooling and thinking about how we might offer webinars this fall to coincide with our Sunday school curriculum. But for now, today will be the last installment, and wait and hear more word coming this fall on what we'll be doing in regards to webinar or video. I am delighted today to introduce our Bible study conversationalists. We have Gordon Matties, the writer of this summer curriculum, Susan Janzen, and Byron Pellecer. Before we turn it over to Gordon to begin the discussion, I invite each of our conversationalists to introduce yourselves. We'll start with you, Gordon.
Thank you, Amy. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. I've lived here since 1984. I grew up in British Columbia. I studied in a variety of places, including and living in Nashville, Tennessee for 4 years. Now, I've recently retired from teaching at Canadian Mennonite University here in Winnipeg. I'm delighted to be here with you.
And I'm Susan Janzen. I am a conference minister with Central Plains Mennonite Conference, coming to you from my office in Kelowna, Iowa. I've lived in Iowa for the past 16, 17 years now, but was raised in Kansas and still call Kansas home. I have in the past written a couple of quarters of Adult Bible Study Guide, and actually used to be part of the group that worked on the outlines for the 6-year cycle that, at least that's how it used to be for Adult Bible Study Guide. And so I still work with the Church of the Brethren with their counterpart to Adult Bible Study Guide. So I'm delighted to be here and had a great time this month getting into the words of wisdom with all of you.
And hello, my name is Byron Pellecer. I'm currently residing in Harrisonburg in Virginia. I have served the church in different capacities across the board in different ways. I have written also some articles and modules, both English and Spanish. And I'm very delightful to be here today, being part of this conversations. Thank you.
Gordon, we'll turn it over to you as the writer of this study to give us a bit of introduction and launching points for conversation.
Good, thank you, Amy. I won't be repeating much of what I said or wrote in the study guide itself, But let's launch in. Many voices in our culture compete for attention, for our attention and our allegiance. We're tugged one way and then the other, all the while realizing that we need to make choices along the way. Some of the voices are demanding life-giving changes to the way it's always been done. And other options aren't always clearly marked as leading to flourishing on the one hand or death on the other. And yet that's what Proverbs 9 is suggesting. Choices need to be made. Now it's clear from Proverbs 9 that the book of Proverbs was compiled for the education of young men. The focus on two women in this and other chapters of Proverbs, especially within chapters 1 to 9, the focus on two women participates in the patriarchal assumptions of the day. Now here in Proverbs 9, this other woman is presented as folly. The choice being offered is stark. There are two women, wisdom and folly. And for those who wish to flourish in life, actually there is only one worth considering. Now let's have a closer look at this provocative text. Now I will be following along the breakdown of the study guide. In verses 1 to 6, wisdom is personified as a woman inviting guests to her feast, and she offers those who are teachable to eat and drink. The feast is on, but who would turn down an invitation to a gourmet dinner with wine and meat nonetheless? But that's exactly the point. To join the banquet, one has to recognize one's complicity with ignorance. Verse 4 identifies the guest list, the naive and those who lack sense. Now, who wants to admit that? Such admission requires vulnerability. So perhaps the first actionable item in these first 6 verses is to recognize our own folly. Wisdom invites us in verse 6 to turn from our simplistic ways and walk in the way of understanding or insight. But what does that mean? In verses 7 to 9, wisdom provides a few examples of how it works. These verses seem to imply that it's not worth trying to correct the wicked or the foolish or the misguided or the scoffer. But correcting a wise person makes a lot of sense. They will love you for doing it. Correct the wise, and they will become even wiser. Teach the morally upright, and they will learn even more. In other words, one never fully arrives. Wisdom is a destination. Using the old cliche, it's the journey that counts. Wisdom and righteousness can be learned. And that's exactly what I think we're recognizing these days. Many of us are learning to unlearn, to recognize that we were wrong, to recognize that we are the ones invited to wisdom's banquet because we have been simpletons. For example, in the arena of Indigenous relations, let's unlearn and relearn. To begin, how about reading Thomas King's amazing book, The Inconvenient Indian? Thomas King, The Inconvenient Indian. And to unlearn and relearn racism, right now I'm beginning to read Drew Hart's book, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, published by Herald Press. And in the chat section of the Zoom here, you can find references to that book, which right now is happily on sale. So now to verse 10, and where we find a reiteration of the fear of the Lord. We've seen that motif a number of times in previous weeks. The phrase, we found it in chapter 1, chapter 8 again, The phrase has been used 2 ways in the book of Proverbs, and in the first 9 chapters, it's used about 4 or 5 times. One of those ways is related to knowledge of God or knowledge that comes from God, and the second is related to righteousness, justice, and the hatred of evil, ethical categories. So the expression fear of the Lord is used in both theological and ethical ways. It's used both in personal and public ways. These can't be separated, the theological, ethical, or the personal, public. In other words, trust and vulnerability are bound up in the quest for wisdom, as we see in Proverbs 3, verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own insight. This, in a nutshell, is what fear of the Lord requires. Trust and a kind of a healthy skepticism about one's own capacity to understand. So then, after offering a few examples of how wisdom works in practice and how wisdom is grounded in reverence and relationship with God, then in verse 11, wisdom speaks again in the first person and promises life. Then, in fact, verse 12 begins this way as translated in the Common English Bible. If you are wise, it is to your benefit. So wisdom is life-giving in more ways than one. By contrast, however, folly or scoffing or cynicism has no lasting benefits. I wonder about the proportion of wisdom or scoffing in our public and political discourse these days, or even in our friendship circles. How often do we find language that reflects wisdom or language that reflects scoffing? Now on to verses 13 to 18. This chapter is framed by discourses about and by 2 women, wisdom and folly, as I mentioned earlier. And as you can see quite clearly in the text, wisdom offered meat, bread, and wine. Folly, however, offers only bread and water, and it's stolen at that. Her banquet is far from gourmet. In fact, it is poisonous in that its banquet hall is nothing other than Sheol, the place of the dead. This kind of rhetoric intends to dissuade the young man from pursuing counterfeit flourishing. So on the one hand, there is the virtuous woman, wisdom. But in 5 passages within Proverbs 1 to 9, there are references to the dangerous or the foreign woman or to the adulteress. You can find those references in chapters 2, 5, 6, 7, and now 9. Of course, both women are personifications. They are figures of speech. And yes, the foolish woman here does represent the choice to indulge in the way of folly, which is death dealing, to indulge in counterfeit means to flourishing. The texts warn about the real dangers of adultery, of consorting with a prostitute, which make these texts in these first 9 chapters profound warnings to young men who are likely the original audience of this compilation of motivational speeches in Proverbs 1 to 9. Yet, read today, it seems as though one could just as well, if not better, replace the foolish woman with foolish man. Or in those other texts in Proverbs 1 to 9, we could replace the dangerous woman, the foreign woman, the adulteress with expressions like this: violent man, abusive man, seductive man. What I'm suggesting is that we need to transpose this text so that it allows us to talk about sexual stereotyping, sexism, sexual abuse, and more. Having said that, I think the foolish woman personification is a continuation of the seductive power of counterfeit promises that we have seen in previous weeks. I mentioned money, sex, power. And as we see today, and I mentioned those in the study guide, as we see today, however, all of those are linked to racism in one way or another. I suggest you watch the videos by Phil Vischer, the developer of VeggieTales. In one of those, he describes the history of systemic racism in the United States. It's a short, about 8-minute video, a talk. In the other one, he describes how he himself has benefited from systemic racism. It's a profound confession that I think we do well to listen to and to learn from. Now, of course, we could also talk about the fear of the other, the fear of whomever is different, let's say of immigrants. These are analogies by extension from our text, by taking the foolish woman metaphor and drawing analogies. I guess I'm asking, how might this negative stereotype that we see in Proverbs 1-9, how might it be transposed, to use a musical analogy today? Is she nothing other than the voice of, isn't she nothing other than the voice of the dominant culture? And if you look at verses 13 and following, if she is the voice of the dominant culture, she is loud, verse 13, prominent, verse 14. She appeals to the gullible, verses 15 and 16. She attracts those who simply want to get what they can for themselves without being aware of the cost to others, verse 17. So yes, there are those who don't know that there's a deathly way about whatever promises flourishing by counterfeit means. And so there's a bundle of things we could talk about here in this chapter. None of them are particularly easy. Maybe the most difficult is to recognize that we, in fact, are the ones being invited to the banquet of woman wisdom. And she assumes that we are simpletons and that we ourselves are ignorant. And therefore, we should basically come to her dinner, because it's there that we're going to learn how to unlearn and relearn. So other things we could talk about, well, they'll come up as we get into our conversation together. And remember, please type your comments in the chat function, and Amy will try to moderate those and squeeze them into the conversation sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gordon, for getting us started there. And for those of you who are joining us live, you do have access to that chat function. And in that chat function, I have posted links to the Phil Vischer video that Gordon referenced, to the book Trouble I've Seen, published by Herald Press, the book imprint of Menno Media, and to the other book that is posted here that I lost the name of, The Inconvenient Indian. So those links are all there in the chat, and you can follow.
Amy, how about the Q&A function at the bottom? Is that where people should type?
They can either type in the Q&A or the chat. They are both enabled.
Okay.
For this call. So Byron and Susan, where do we want to start today?
I am compelled. I'm still, again, unpacking all these invitations for the voices competing. And I resonate with that. It's a lot of voices. And I myself constantly finding out, what am I listening? Who am I listening to anyway? On the one hand, Gordon, thank you. Proverbs 9, it's the invitation is to choose life over death. Deuteronomy 26 also kind of does the same thing, the invitation to choose life. On the other hand, I also kind of wrestle with that fact. It might be very simple to see right in front of me, but yet, if I choose one or the other, what are my resources? What are the sources that I am using? Those that are to my disposal. And in other words, how my decision has been informed by what kind of resources. You did mention about the fear of the Lord, the wisdom, whether theological or ethical, it's grounded in that. It's a theological component. So I wonder if all these voices reflect my theological reflections. I have nothing against other human thoughts, but which ones are the one informing my decisions? So still, it's a process, but yet I have to make a decision bottom line, whether it is choosing wisdom or otherwise.
That's where my mind was going too, and I just had to think, if the food's better and where you end up going is better, why do we so often choose the path of folly? You know, the food's better on the path toward abundant life, right?
Indeed, it is. Oh yeah, we know that, but you know, counterfeit flourishing is often more immediate.
Mm-hmm.
There's, as I said earlier, there is a challenge to be faced by listening to the invitation of wisdom, because one could easily say, "Oh, I don't need to go to that. I don't need that banquet. I'll just give money." You know, or yeah, I already know that stuff. Oh yeah, I understand racism. Oh yeah, I understand the challenges of our culture. I understand the problems associated with family systems and dysfunction. I understand why I struggle with wealth and poverty. I don't really need to learn anything because I already know. And yet, we're confronted with this these voices that say, "Wait a minute, you. I don't know if you really understand how deep into it you are." I could use a bad word. You're into it very deep. This pile of manure, and you don't know it. And this is why the video by Phil Vischer is so interesting. Yeah, especially the one in which he narrates his life journey, which has been sort of had an impact. How his own life situation has had an impact on him, benefiting from the system in which he was raised. So the first step, I guess, is to acknowledge that verse 6 says, lay aside immaturity. Or abandon your simplistic ways in Common English Bible. So one has to begin by acknowledging, hey, I'm the one who's in this simplistic pattern. I'm the one who's immature. I'm the one that needs this banquet of wisdom. So once I acknowledge that, then let's come to Byron's question and say, what is the food that she's offering and where will we find it? And I like Byron's question on that. So I guess the first point is repentance. Although wisdom doesn't use the word repentance. That's a word from the prophets. But wisdom offers the word lay aside immaturity here, or abandon your simplistic ways. But basically, we're talking about the same thing. And so once you've repented or acknowledged your own complicity in the system, then you can begin to take the food that wisdom offers. And the question is where to find it. Well, I guess because I've been a prof over the years, my first response is, hey, read this book, read that book, which is basically what I did to you with you here this afternoon. I said, here's a couple of books, get started. But meanwhile, I'm, sitting here in my office and reading. And okay, that's something I can offer, but in the end, reading a book is maybe enlightening, but where does the rubber meet the road? And that's where I think we need, and I'm pretty sure Byron is going to suggest something now about the community, the church.
It's one of the things that I agree with you. I think the temptation sometimes is one is tempted actually not to do that type of exercise. I know this, okay, but knowing it's good, I think is the first step. Then reflecting upon in your own reality, and don't get me wrong, books are awesome. I think we cannot dismiss one over the other. I think wisdom encompasses to get all the facts together and put them in together and reflect and then act upon those. So whether it's the book, whether it's a conversation, one way or the other, we need to do that. Now, on the other hand, I don't think the invitation of wisdom is to be perfect. I don't think the perfection is not one stage or one event. As I often tell my friends concerning the church, there is no such thing as a perfect church. But if you find it, please don't go in. You're going to mess that up. Stay with us. We're in the path of transformation. I think part of the wisdom and that type of exercise and reflection, it's just that process that will get us from one point to the other and to the other, and we're going to revisit that again. It's not only linear, like one sector of a society might once think is or promotes to, and it's not also like a roller coaster. I think it's all of the above, and finding the wisdom right there and different practices from different people from different backgrounds, ages, etc., gender, etc., that can help us out in this type of wisdom. So whether it's society, church, community, individuals, different settings, I think there is wisdom all over the place. And yet, is it grounded in the feet of God? That's for me as a follower of Christ. Obviously, that's a key question. So my reflections on wisdom does reflect the feet of God. That's something I don't have an easy answer, and I don't pretend to, but that's one of the things that I am wrestling with, and I'm happy with that. And so it's kind of like, again, try and error, do it back, go back to the drawing board, but do something and then go back until you find whatever you think God is calling, which is also part of wisdom, in my opinion.
I think the wisdom tradition, the sages of that put Proverbs together. I mean, each of these traditions, as we call them in the Old Testament, wisdom, prophecy, law, and so on, each have their own ways of summarizing the essence. Yeah. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, is one of the key notes of the wisdom tradition. If we look to Jesus, for example, since you mentioned him, Byron, he summarizes his teaching in the kingdom of God is at hand. And as in Matthew 5, seek first the kingdom of God. And so what is it the first thing that we seek? Is it to orient ourselves into the orbit or the sphere of God's order of things, God's way of thinking and imagining how things ought to be? In Jesus, that's kingdom of God. In Proverbs, it's this fear of the Lord leads to wisdom. So that's what I think, along with trust and vulnerability, reverence and awe, all of these wrapped up together in fear of the Lord. together with hatred of evil. So we have to learn to recognize. Can I just say one more thing about what you said? If you look at verses 7 to 9, I have a question here about this. It's as though wisdom is saying it's not really worthwhile trying to correct a scoffer or trying to correct or rebuke the wicked, because you're just going to get hurt, so or get hated. Does that mean we should not be trying to correct truly wicked things? It does say in verse 8b that the wise, when rebuked, will love you. So maybe we should just be focusing on rebuking one another in the hope that all of us are sort of wise. And so we should try to just build each other up and not worry too much about knocking down or rebuking or correcting the wicked. And so
Well,
yeah,
I was just going to say, I do know that trying to correct someone on social media generally doesn't have the intended effect. So I think there is some wisdom in that that thought about not correcting a scoffer, so to speak. The one thing I was going to say in response to what Byron said was, and you kind of went that direction, but the verse that keeps coming into my mind is when Jesus talks about coming that we might have life and we might have it abundantly. I mean, that's really what this is getting at, right? The way of wisdom is to have the abundant life that Jesus promised. And so, to me, this is like, this whole discussion it's just really hopeful because especially when we talk about the journey being as important as getting, we want to get somewhere. We want to gain wisdom, but we will never attain full measure, I don't think. And so to me, it's hopeful that the goal is the abundance, the abundance of the kingdom, the abundance of Jesus' way, and that we can, I guess it lessens the pressure in some ways. Like it ups the ante in a sense, but it also lessens the pressure to have it all figured out right now.
And I don't think we have to. We don't have to know and figure out everything else. But on the other hand, we kind of get the idea what is it that we might need and probably pursue that and then reflect again and then we just find out that we hit a wall. What do we do then? Then let's go back. Let's move to the left. And then I cannot escape from even thinking about personalities. Some personalities are more like, oh, I'm going to do this regardless of. They're just hitting walls. And my personality goes like, oh, wait. That's a couple of walls already. We need to go back and do something different. In the meantime, I got a friend that goes like, oh, no, we're going to knock it down. Don't worry about it. I'm like, oh, okay. So I don't know how wisdom is going to look like right there. Should I listen and get my hammer, slash hammer and do it? Or can we go around perhaps and find other ways? All of the above? But my point is, I think we cannot dismiss one or the other. Even when we not have it right the first time, or we don't know exactly what will be next. We know it's going to be next, and yet I agree with you, Susan. We're going to get there. Like Gordon says, it's about the journey. Yeah, it's not a cliche, but knowing that we're going to get somewhere. If it's only just the journey, then I think it's not that wise enough. But we got to go. We got to go in that journey. In the meantime, the journey is the most difficult thing.
The journey is
it's kind of like the GPS. When the GPS tells me recalculating.
Yeah.
My family laughs at me because even the GPS speaks before I turn. Recalculating. My wife goes like, oh, there we go. It's recalculating life again. I'm like, oh man, even the GPS. Anyway, so I see wisdom like that today. It's kind of like GPS. The spirit, Christ's spirit is recalculating life.
Yet it's not it's not just an endless, aimless journey though either. There is a direction or an arc or however you want to call it, trajectory. to it. And so I don't want to, like, I don't want to let myself off the hook, but it's also, I just feel like it helps maybe even enjoy the journey more.
Show some mercy to ourselves.
But
Okay.
the question of how to, oh, sorry, Gordon, go ahead.
You go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the question of going back to where I jumped in about the whole, how do you help someone, and you know, it goes to the question that's in the chat too about community. Like, how do we, thinking of racism, let's say, how do you convince someone that there is a conversation that even needs to be had sometimes? Like I've personally experienced some pushback on some of the anti-racism things that we've been talking about in our conference and as a denomination over the last month. And so how do you start the conversation with folks who don't realize there's even a conversation that needs to be had when it comes to the whole idea of wisdom, I guess?
Yeah.
One of the things that stands out to me, and I think we should take this question here that Lorraine posed to all of us, is this question of vulnerability too in the community. I think that's a piece of it as well. And Gordon, you write in this guide at the top of page 23 about how the wise aren't afraid of being vulnerable. And to me, that was one of the pieces that stood out in what you wrote this week. How do we take things to the community? And I'll read here the question that Lorraine poses. She says, I agree with the advice to look for the wisdom in the community. And I also think the community is facing its own culpability in unthinking ways of death, particularly for others. How do we as the community reach for the real meal? In other words, how do we do some serious self-analysis? How do we help each other be vulnerable? That would be my addition to that. To maybe realize that we are the scoffers rather than the wise from time to time, when we think we're the wise and not the scoffers. Anyone want to take Lorraine's question or my twist on it?
Well, the only thing I will say in the whole thing of are we the scoffers as opposed to the wise, I mean, I think that's a problem dominant culture always has, right? Like, you know, when we read Bible stories and reflect on them, do we put ourselves like the Good Samaritan? Like, which character are we? Are we the victimized person? Are we the ones who pass by? You know, are we the one the Samaritan who stops and helps? And, you know, I think far too often those of us who identify with dominant culture don't really put ourselves in the right position in some of these scenarios.
For me, probably it begins again with theological nuances. I think it has to go deep into our Christian formation. What are we teaching? What are we learning? Are we talking about this? How often do we do that? Whose agenda are we following? Are we following the kingdom's agenda, or are we following the society's agenda today? I wonder what's next. This is not about trending things. It's real. It's a serious conversation. It's hurtful conversations, like all conversations that affects human life one way or the other. Those are conversations that have to take place. And perhaps for me also, it's understanding God's grace. That does not give me a leeway, so to speak, to dismiss anything else. No, I don't think so. But it begins there when we take the scripture, the text, very seriously. I like Paul. Paul, it's kind of like I like him, and sometimes I wish Paul will say something different. But especially it goes and tells me, hey, look, when you read scripture, man, you can look at yourself in the mirror. I'm like, oh, I'm handsome. All right, good, yeah. oh, it's actually the invitation of this self-reflection to the deepest of my heart and my intentions and my thoughts and my doings that only God knows them. And then being naked before God, in every sense of the word, this is who we are. Or as car dealership sometimes tells you with vehicles with second owners, they say it's as is. And I think that's the type of faith that I am challenged to reflect as is. What you see is what you get. But that doesn't mean I cannot change. I don't think so. So the invitation to this topic, to this reality and other realities, I think it begins right there. Maybe those who preach and teach and being part of Christian formation, we do again pick up on Gordon's. We need to find out what are we learning now, what we need to unlearn, and what we need to relearn. Deep analysis and as honest as we can be, knowing that might be painful. But painful in this case is good. It's kind of like giving birth to a new life. And be graceful. Being graceful, I think, is being graceful. Not everybody's going to think the way I do. And needless to say, I don't expect people to force me to think others do. That's a simulation. And then we get a bigger problem anyway.
I like that latest comment by Elaine, where she comments about correcting the wise versus correcting the wicked, which you see in verses 7 through 9. She mentions Richard Rohr and his core principles for action and contemplation. She says the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. Oppositional energy only creates more of the same. That's a very nice sort of a paraphrase of what these verses are saying here. And all too often, and when I say our political discourse, I don't refer to any one particular person here, but generally the political discourse in Canada and the United States is to challenge your opponent and present the opponent as a caricature of what he or she actually is. Sometimes those caricatures are true. In fact, when you point out the character of your opponent, there may be truth to it, but is it useful? Does it make sense to keep doing it that way? Isn't it better, as Elaine quotes here, the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better? And I guess both of you, Byron and Susan, working very directly in church contexts and conference ministry, this is what we hope happens in and through our church communities, and why people are taking these adult Bible study into their adult ed courses and discussing these things. Summer is a pretty lax time of year when a lot of people are out and about, but come fall, that adult ed context is where people and small groups, fellowship groups in homes, these are places where people seriously engage, I hope, in what Lorraine mentioned earlier is serious self-analysis. I found this nice bundle of questions or comments on Facebook the other day. I don't have it right in front of me, but a whole list of statements that appear to be acknowledgement of wrong. For example, I didn't know that. I must have inadequate information. Or I always thought I was right on that point, but you know what? Now that you mention it, I might be wrong. Or I always thought my family taught this, or my community taught that, and well, now that I look at it through your eyes, I see that I'm wrong. Those kinds of things reflect wisdom, when one can learn to say those kinds of things, and say, you know what, I like verse 9, I can keep on learning. So yes, although a practice of the better is possible, one can only practice the better by acknowledging where one has participated in, and what's the word I used earlier, is where one has been complicit in supporting, unconsciously even, the status quo, which is damaging and harmful to myself and others. In fact, it leads to death, according to verse 18.
So part of cultivating wisdom is cultivate, or part of acquiring wisdom is cultivating some of those other, I don't know if virtues is the right word for it, but when you were talking just now, Gordon, I was thinking of empathy. You know, being able to view things from the point of view of another. You know, and some of these other things that tend to get sometimes devalued in our society, not always, but are really part of the key. I mean, I know I keep mentioning humility, but there's humility and empathy and just an openness to hear another point of view and not feel completely defensive about it. You know, and the vulnerability we've talked about. I mean, wisdom is a lot of things. And, you know, I think some of these actions we can take are actually part of the key to acquiring some of that and sitting down at the feast.
I kind of saw that also from the intercultural transformation as a way also of giving into the wisdom and embrace that. Whether that reality is being reflected in our own neighborhoods, or needless to say, our local congregation, area conferences, denominations, etc., that's a different story. Not only for the sake of, as a token, we have now one or two. No, I think it has to reflect the society in which we live in. And so, in other words, it's kind of, as a local congregations, look around your society. The church building is in one place, and families live separately from that church building. And normally, the neighbors know more about what's going on within that building than actually church members within that building when the church gathers on Sunday. So I think intercultural transformation might be probably another avenue to be explored, to help us out, to inform us towards this more integrated society in which racism and discrimination will not be daily bread, and in which also means that we all are going to embrace each other's comments and way of living. Doesn't mean that this is better than the other one. Then we just done nothing except getting together and have coffee together. That would be good. But acknowledging that in your culture, that it's something that is missing that my culture might have. You can use it to complete yours and vice versa. I can use that so I can complete my own, and that will reflect in the church. Let's look around in our congregations. Now let's look around the list and see the last names. And does that reflect the reality or your local communities? That will be my question, because obviously in rural and urban settings, that changes the game. But can you imagine congregations worshiping in different languages? And also leaving church in different ways of cultural reflections. Now that can help us a lot. Acknowledging one another at the same level, not only like from you need to do it my way. That's systemic. That's the problem right there. And it begins. Church plays a big role. That's my point. And I have hope, because the church doesn't belong to us; it belongs to Christ, and He takes care of that. Woo!
And I hear your words as hopeful too, Byron, because I think when we become that kind of community of believers, that is when we will become much closer to the abundant life that Jesus talked about, right?
Eschatological one. Yeah.
Because it's not about, you know, there may be in this whole process of some giving up to get, right? But it's not about the giving up. It's about us all getting and all flourishing. And so that's why I find this so hopeful too.
Yeah. Honoring one another.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to
And-
link a couple of things that people have commented
Yeah.
in the last few minutes. Leroy says, maybe wisdom is being willing to accept change. Is that correct? And then I'll come back to his earlier comment about liking the GPS comment that Byron made. Here's the thing. I don't use GPS, but I've been in vehicles where the GPS is on, and GPS does say recalculating. But here's the thing: what you can do with that is say, "Oh, I don't believe you. I'm gonna go where I'm gonna go." And you can tell me to recalculate, but I'm not going to listen. And when you do that, I mean, okay, this is just a metaphor, right? But when you do that, not paying attention to the voice that knows how to get there, you're going to get lost, or you're going to waste time, or you're going to look like a fool. And the thing is, you have to be willing to change direction. This is what Leroy is saying. Wisdom is learning how to listen to the voices asking you to change direction. And you can say all you want. Oh, I'm sorry. And I mean, I've learned this from hard experience living in a family. No names are being mentioned. But you know, you can say sorry all you want, but what really needs to happen is different behavior, right? And that's, I think, what wisdom is striving toward, and why all of chapter Proverbs 10 to 31, most of it is about changing behavior. It's about learning the ropes, about learning, and I used this image the other day, about steering. Like, steering is a metaphor that I used to drive an old 1956 Ford, in which the steering wheel had a lot of play in it, and you could go like this and continue to drive in a straight line. You cannot do that with new cars, but with old cars like that, you could, because there was a lot of play in the steering wheel. So when we say that wisdom is the art of steering, it's not like you're driving a sports car. It's like you're driving a 1956 Ford. There is play in that steering wheel, and yet there is danger if you push it a little too far that way or a little too far that way. You have to know what the range of health and wellness is within the direction you're going, and then you have to listen to the voices that are telling you, teaching you, instructing you, be it friends, community, sources of wisdom, and one has to learn to discern what voices are good and what voices lead to death. And that's, I think, what this chapter is about. Having, never mind the fact that we're dealing with stereotypical male, female, patriarchal culture images here. That's still important to talk about. But when we get underneath the metaphor and say, okay, what does it mean? We're talking about making wise choices that are life-giving and not death-dealing. And way too much in our culture is death-dealing, and we don't even know it. And only the community around us that we trust and hope will be truthful to us can help us.
Thank you very much, Gordon and Byron and Susan. I'm going to jump in here and start to draw us to a close, but just let's all virtually as well give Gordon and Susan and Byron our thanks. They have been our conversationalists here, Byron for the last 3 weeks, Susan and Gordon for the whole month of June. You've given so much, given me so many insights, and those who've joined us as well, to think about how we discern wisdom in our lives, how we walk the walk that we are striving to walk and learn along the way. So thank you, each of you, so much. We do appreciate so much your time and your insights, and we're all leading with deeper understandings. Thank you to all of you who have joined us today in this webinar. Again, it's being recorded. It will be posted later on Menomedia's YouTube channel, so you can watch for it there, and also on Menomedia's Facebook page and Twitter feed. As I said at the beginning, unfortunately, this is our last Wednesday Word. We tried this as an experiment in the month of June, and while the four of us, have had a lot of fun, and I know those of you who've joined us have appreciated this as well, we have not had as many people join us as we might have hoped for. So we are going to retool and do some thinking internally at Menomedia about how to deliver webinars to coincide with our adult curriculum going forward. So thank you all for joining us today and this month in this series, and stay tuned for what we will be doing in the future. Until then, we will depart today and hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It has been fun.
Shalom, paz de Dios.
Thank
Goodbye.
you
Bye.
for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.